This message comes from Mattress Firm. It's Mattress Firm's Black Friday sale, and their best doorbuster ever starts Friday. Get a queen mattress for just $89.99 plus a free pillow while supplies last. Offer available for pickup only through Sunday. See store for details.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Land's End Outfitters. You've worked hard to build your brand, so why settle for one-size-fits-all clothing? Land's End Outfitters creates apparel your employees truly want to wear. See why Land's End Outfitters has been a branded apparel supplier to some of the world's most respected brands for more than 30 years. Go to business.landsend.com/pod20 and use code POD20 for 20% off your first product. That's business.landsend.com/pod20, code POD20.
Hey everyone, it's B.A. Parker. Before we start the show, a quick word about what makes Code Switch and everything you hear from NPR possible. It's you. NPR is public media, which means we care about you, and we've had a bold vision from the start to create a more informed public. Think of it as civic infrastructure, freely available to everyone. That includes covering communities that haven't always had their voices heard. And we serve places all across the country, big, small, rural, and urban, many of which have seen their other news sources diminish. We can do this all thanks to your support. So on behalf of all of us at Code Switch, I want to say how grateful we are for listeners like you. We appreciate you digging into the tough questions and complicated histories with us, from the role of race in reality TV, to A Beautiful Day in the Park, to what anti-trans laws have to do with colonialism. And a huge thank you if you already support this work through NPR Plus or by donating to your local station. Your generosity fuels one of the most trusted news sources in America today. If you haven't made the leap to contributing yet, Giving Tuesday is almost here. So it's the perfect time to support what you love. Sign up for perks across more than 25 podcasts with NPR Plus today. It's a tax-deductible donation that helps make the world a more curious place, so you can feel good about it while you enjoy sponsor-free listening. Join us at plus.npr.org, or you can always make a gift at donate.npr.org. Thanks!
What's good? This is Code Switch. I'm Gene Demby.
And I'm B.A. Parker.
We are a couple weeks out from the election, Parker. I mean, I know folks are tired of talking and thinking about it, you know what I mean?
There's just been a lot of generalized disassociating going on.
Yeah. Just people, gritting their teeth every time they get a news notification on their phone, just popping up, telling them about a cabinet appointment or something.
Right. We lived through a Trump presidency before. Now, regardless of your politics, we already know it's gonna be a bumpy few years.
I mean, she says that with understatement.
We know that Trump is not afraid to fire people abruptly or announce sweeping policy ideas on social media or chide his fellow Republicans for being insufficiently loyal.
Chide. That's a very generous way of putting it. And there are a lot of important lessons, we should be learning and taking away from the election results, which is why I wanted to holler at Astead Herndon.
Yes, he covers politics for the New York Times. He's been everywhere the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, he's been making the rounds. Astead is the host of the Run Up podcast, and over the last couple of years, him and his crew, they've been going around the country, sitting down with regular folks and likely voters and asking them about this election. And because he's been sticking his microphone in people's faces, he peeped that something was going on out in the real world that most professional political types were missing. And that meant that their assumptions about how people might cast their ballots, particularly how people of color might cast their ballots, were way, way off the mark. He even said those assumptions were maybe low-key racist.
Low-key?
So that's why I think it's important to look back. It's because I think that some of the questions we ask ourselves about, what does this election tell us about our neighbors, about our country, about our future, are somewhat tied to the choices that people had in front of them and whether those choices or whether the political system is even reflective of the public concern.
And so on this episode, why the browning of America has not been the boon for Democrats that so many in politics predicted, and how we should make sense of the widening gulf between politicians and everyday Americans.
Oh, boy. All right, take it away, Gene.
This message comes from BetterHelp. It's important to take time to show gratitude towards others, but it's equally important to thank yourself. Life throws a lot of curveballs, and being grateful isn't always easy. Therapy can help remind you of all that you're worthy of and all that you do have. Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Try at betterhelp.com/NPR today to get 10% off your first month. This message comes from Sun and Ski Sports, helping families make memories on the mountain. This Black Friday, save up to 50% on top brands for the outdoor adventurer in your life, with an extra 10% off select items online from November 19th to December 2nd. Visit your local Sun and Ski Sports to shop exclusive in-store offers, like enter to win a $200 shopping spree, or explore sunandski.com. Find yourself outside with Sun and Ski Sports.
This message comes from Noom, using psychology and biology to build personal meal plans to fit your lifestyle, taking into account dietary restrictions, medical issues, and other personal needs with daily lessons that are personalized to you and your goals. Noom's flexible program focuses on progress instead of perfection to help you build new habits for a healthier lifestyle. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com.
Astead Herndon has been on the road for the past several years. He's been asking voters, asking political candidates some big questions about the U.S.'s political ecosystem. Questions like,
why do the parties seem like they are heading toward a rematch that 70% of Americans per polling do not want?
When you say rematch, you mean another election with Trump and Biden at the top of the tickets for their parties?
Yes. And the unique thing about this one, though, is that we had so much overwhelming evidence that public thought that that was a bad thing, you know? And so I was just wondering, why were they going in one direction while all the signs pointed to a country in a different direction? And so that's why I think it's important to look back. It's because I think that some of the questions we ask ourselves about, what does this election tell us about our neighbors, about our country, about our future, are somewhat tied to the choices that people had in front of them, and whether those choices or whether the political system is even reflective of the public concerns.
What do you think of the ways that the results do not reflect the way that Americans broadly felt? I mean, obviously, there are the two candidates themselves, right?
The overarching theme of the last couple years was a double hatery feeling about the candidates. More than Democrat, Republican, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, the thing we heard most from DR, independent, whoever, was, I don't like the options in front of me, and I wish I had different ones, and I think politics is broken. I don't think that the Democrats, for as much as they talked about democracy, were really presenting something from the premise of the concerns that we were hearing, which is that democracy was broken. They were most just saying that Donald Trump is individually bad and the things that he is doing is bad, or ways he's upending democracy are bad. But they're not kind of working from the same premise that a lot of the people we were hearing from. There are ways that people are upset that could be talked about more by politicians themselves, but aren't. And I think that that's the way I feel like elections don't give us a full answer of people's concerns, is because they're stuck in this binary choice that's unrepresentative.
What do you attribute this distance between what people are feeling and experiencing on the ground and what the sort of partisan actors, the official partisan actors, are, putting on the platform or not putting on the platform?
Well, I mean, it's a cynical one, but I don't even know if they really care what public interest is fully. I don't think that for most parties, they work from the premise of, what have we heard from our constituents and what can we deliver? They work from a premise of, did we win the last election or not? How do we win the next one or not? And what are the kind of rules of the game they've decided determine those two factors? And that's not the same thing as we heard this, so we're responding to this. Something like education is a good example, because a thing that you hear a ton about from public, but for a lot of political actors, I've talked to them about this, they don't see the political benefit in investing a ton of money there. Not only does a lot of it happen at a local level, but even beyond that, you don't even see the benefits till you're largely out of office. So I'm saying that's a good example of something that usually does not have the type of political incentive to respond to, even though it's something that people want folks to respond to. I think gun violence falls in this. I think housing falls in this. I think there's a lot of issues homelessness. Like there's a lot of kind of tangible issues that I think a lot of people talk about. Fentanyl, like that was a huge one from this year. Opioids, like a thing that people think are tangibly, materially impacting their lives, but it's not where the political conversation is. And so I think that the baseline of that disconnect helps explain some other things we know too. Why were Democrats not being more responsible on inflation concerns? Why didn't they recognize that there has been shifts in attitudes about border and immigration? To me, that all kind of comes from the same place. They're not working from the bottom up. Their biggest effort is not one of listening. And so if that's not really the process that they engage in, of course, there's going to be those big disconnects.
Okay. So 2 of the takeaways that different people have had coming out of this election have been, 1, that the Democratic Party is no longer the party of the working class, and 2, that the country has moved generally to the right. What do you make of those 2 takeaways?
I don't fully think I agree with them fully, but I do think those are reflective of broader trends that are definitely true. Mm-hmm. Like Democrats drop off among working class people. There have been signs about that because the places Democrats have made the biggest gains have been with white college educated folks. And so there's been these signs of drop off. Black turnout wasn't good in the midterms. That like the party has actually shifted who it's reliant on. And so even if Harris won, it would have been through a larger white share of the electorate. And so I'm like, that was true no matter about the result. But I do think the result emphasized that point to people who may not have fully appreciated it before. I guess I think, and I said this on the election night on the Daily, but like, I think it's giving Trump too much credit to act like there is some permanent working class alignment that he has driven and capitalized on, because I don't think Democrats really worked with a full deck over the last 4 years. If they would have had a primary, if they would have had a discussion of where they had, recalibrated on issues from 2019 till now, they would have put all their kind of best voices on the table and decided both on message and messenger, and then put that against Donald Trump, and he would have won. I think that I would feel more comfortable talking about these sort of working class shifts. Because I mostly see it and hear it right now, less as an embrace of Trump as kind of MAGA ideology, but embrace as Trump as a vessel for status quo frustration, for democratic frustration, for incumbency frustration, for desire for change. All of these things that are broader than I think the specifics of the Donald Trump agenda. So I don't think you can play the same notes of white supremacy, race, and class that people, and they weren't even saying class then. They were just saying white supremacy back then is the only reason why Donald Trump won. Like, I don't think that's a fair explanation of the fullness of those results. I don't think, frankly, like just identity stuff is. I think you have to see it as a kind of broader coalition. And I do think on the certain issues, the rightward shift is true, the biggest being immigration. I think that rightward shift is real. For our last episode of the show, I went back to my hometown because we had done this episode with them last year about Black Democrats and how they're changing relationship with the party. And so I gathered all these folks together again. It was people from my community growing up. This is Chicago. These are people from like Obama, Chicago. So we pulled them all together. And one of the things that really stuck out to me from what they talked about was they felt that the multiracial coalition that they had been sold in the Obama era was dead. They did not see themselves in solidarity with other people of color. And I say that broadly because they also talked about wanting to retire that term. Because, they're like, well, if I look at those results, it is only Black folks that decided to prioritize that coalition over everything else. And there was a sense of betrayal among other groups. And I think this is, for me, if you start kind of in Obama era and get to now, I think the remnants of that demographic destiny argument still were mostly the guiding lights for Democrats.
Demographic destiny was the idea that the country is getting browner, right? And so the country was moving into this moment in which you're going to have this rising, emerging multiracial majority, right? Like, as white people become a smaller percentage of the electorate and the population more broadly, then Democrats will have a bunch of natural advantages because the brown people will come out to vote for Democrats.
Exactly. I frankly think, though, we should be more honest about what the depth of that thought really means, right? This is basically the political class coming to the realization that Black people of different classes or Black people of different income levels have different thoughts or may inform their politics differently. This is the realization that Latinos with different countries of origins have different frames of reference. Like, it is actually a very basic realization. It is actually a very fundamental understanding of if you have at any point in your life seen these people as full people and not as simply poll respondents, you would know this, right? Mm-hmm. Like when we were in El Paso talking to Mexican Americans, they kept being like, why do people talk about Cubans and us as a linked group? Like, why do they do that? And so I'm just saying, like, the signs of that kind of fractures have been there for a long time. Mm-hmm. But I think it was like a party or liberalism that had embraced so much of this, like, representation language, had embraced so much of these racial essentialism stuff, that they still thought that I think that in the end of the day, with Donald Trump on the other side, every one of these people would prioritize their racial identity above anything else, and that will bring them back to Democrats. And that is just, to me, finally, that idea is dead. But we should, I think, say, the fact that it lingered for so long is itself a reflection of the distance between the political class and public that I'm talking about. Because I actually don't think that's news to most regular people. Like, I think if you ask most Black people, they know that college education versus non-college will inform folks differently. Or that, or that there are groups of folks, rich and poor, who, yes, have the same racial identity, but don't express it or feel it in the same ways. Those are all things we all know about white people. Every single political operative works from that premise when talking about white people. Nobody thinks that rich or college white people and non-college or poor white people think the same about politics. Or prioritize their racial identity over everything else. Mm-hmm. And so I'm saying all that we have now learned basically adds up to the same assumption that was always made about them, which, in my opinion, is how you basically define racism. And so that's why I say, because it's little r racist. Even I wouldn't disagree with the other characterizations, but I just think it's reflective of how, and this is just the theme of the work has been, how distant those decision makers are from these communities. And how much these folks have put themselves in a protective bubble that has the same blind spots that a lot of, elite spaces have. That's the reason I hammer on the kind of demographic destiny thing is, like, in 2012, the Republican autopsy after Obama beats Romney, the infamous one that says the party needs to become more inclusive and diverse to embrace a changing country.
Right.
That was a distillation of what both sides had come to an agreement on was going to govern the next 30 years. Mm-hmm. And all I want to do, if I have any legacy in national media, it is that assumption was, I think, racist. Mm-hmm. And that assumption was, I think, classist. That assumption, I think, was one that was reductive of the individual experiences of these people. And the fact that they, too, have many identities that matter to them. And so that's all I'm trying to say is, yes, we have learned something. And I do think that idea has died last week. But I think we should also ask, why did it take such root in the first place? Because the big lesson we've learned here is really a basic one.
When we come back, Astead talks about a very testy interview he had with Vice President Harris.
One thing that Kamala Harris does not like is, like, being told by someone else who she is, And so there was something about those questions that I think immediately were off-putting in a way that I could have seen coming, but I kind of didn't.
That is coming up. Stay with us.
This message comes from Wise, the app for doing things in other currencies. Send, spend, or receive money internationally, and always get the real-time mid-market exchange rate with no hidden fees. Download the Wise app today or visit wise.com. T's and C's apply.
This message comes from Viking, committed to exploring the world in comfort. Journey through the heart of Europe on an elegant Viking longship with thoughtful service, destination-focused dining, and cultural enrichment on board and on shore. And every Viking voyage is all-inclusive with no children and no casinos. Discover more at Viking.com. This message comes from Progressive and its Name Your Price tool. Say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show coverage options within your budget. Visit Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Hey fam, Scott Simon here. I'm in my fundraising era. Had a little help from Gen Z on this script. NPR is always cooking, no cap. So when I say Giving Tuesday is coming, I think you understand the assignment. Please donate today. Make your gift at donate.npr.org. Thanks, bestie.
Gene, just Gene, mostly, I guess. Code Switch. We've been talking about this year's election results with Astead Herndon. He covers politics for the New York Times and has been asking folks what they want from their politicians. And he said that one of the big miscalculations that the Democrats made was about how much representation mattered to voters of color. Kamala Harris didn't really, lean into the identity stuff. You know, she had a pretty light touch on this stuff. She didn't really talk about how her presidency would have been historic. She didn't really call attention to her racial heritage, even after Donald Trump, claimed that she wasn't really black. Does that tell us something about Kamala Harris and her sort of comfort or discomfort talking about these things? Or does that tell us something about the sort of efficacy of these politics of representation?
Yeah. Well, one, I don't think Kamala Harris was the main or secondary character of this election. I think she was, basically on election day, she paid many sins for Joe Biden and Democrats broadly. And I think some of the evidence points to that. But I also think this was supposed to be the good part of having POC candidates is that they didn't have to talk about it. I remember doing a story in 2018 about how Democrats always run white people in swing districts. And then all of a sudden, post-Trump, that wasn't true anymore. One, because white people get a little tingle voting out of a person of color. But also, they didn't have to talk about it. They didn't have to make it a huge deal. They actually allowed them to focus on issues of other types. And so I think she was running the playbook that was supposed to be run. I think it really mattered that was not the way she introduced herself to America originally. She did talk about identity during the presidential run. It was a huge part of it.
I am so proud to be a daughter of Oakland, California. And it was just a few miles away that my parents first met as graduate students at UC Berkeley, where they were active in the civil rights movement. And they were born half a world apart from each other. My father, Donald, came from Jamaica to study economics. My mother, Kamala, came from India to study the science of fighting disease.
I think that people still associate some of that stuff with her. And I don't think that's just because of her identity, even though it lasts longer for people of color or women than others. But I think it's true that was her intro to everyone. And one thing I just think that not only the lack of primary did, it made her individually a flip-flopper rather than her as a weather vane for the party's overall shifts. The way that she's moved on immigration is the same way a lot of Democrats have moved on immigration. Some of that stuff, I just think they would have recorrected if they would have had a process and a primary where they listened to public and then did this on their own terms, rather than 2 months before the election, where I think it fell as if she was individually shifting position.
And you're saying that she was constrained because of Joe Biden, because Joe Biden decided to stay in the race after he said he had hinted that he would only be a one-term president and he would be a transitional figure. And so then she was basically running a race tethered to his legacy and also with a short primary, with a non-existent primary.
With a non-existent, tethered to his legacy, and she was running as an agent of the now and what was clearly a change moment. And the party ruined their ability to speak most directly to change by the Joe Biden reelection candidacy. And I think secondary, her unwillingness to break from Joe Biden when she became the nominee. But I think that was a kind of hard thing to do at that point, considering they had so viscerally defended him for so long. And so I just think it was a tough kind of set of choices to put them in. But I'm not someone who says that racism and sexism didn't matter. Lord knows that Trump has had a specific masculinity message, has taken that to that kind of podcast, incel-y ecosystem. And I think that the politics of masculinity was a huge impact of this race. And I think another point about racism and sexism I think impacted Harris, too, was were the years leading up to the candidate switch. Like when I was doing the profile on her last year, I was shocked at how many Democrats were, without prompting, would call me, say, I hear you're working on this thing about Harris. Can I go on background or off the record to insult her? That has never happened.
Wow.
That's never happened to me with a politician of that level. Never. And so I'm saying, it was, in my opinion, it was super racist and sexist. Like, it was a willingness that I had never heard before. And their cocooning of Biden's problem impacted so many things. But one of the things, they never saw, there was a universe where she could have been the solution from the jump. There was a universe they could have set her up like that. The party could have rallied around her the way they rallied around her 3 months ago. And then we wouldn't have had 2.5 years of focusing on her shortcomings, her absence. Where is she? The immigration czar. Like, you don't give the person you think is going to be the next nominee the immigration assignment, right? Mm-hmm. That was all decisions. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those were all decisions they made, partially because they found her an imperfect vessel to lead the party in the future. And they refused to see past those imperfections until they had to. Mm-hmm. And so all I'm saying is, like, I think that it's important to call out the ways that race and sex impacts the electorate and how they view women candidates, particularly Black women. But I think that's actually shortchanging its impact in this race.
You had this profile that was basically about her. The sort of thrust of it was that she both refuses to be defined and sort of bristles when people try to hold her to some kind of ideological sort of definition, right? I mean, that conversation, that I think about this exchange in particular all the time because it seemed to encapsulate a lot of the frustrations that people have felt about Vice President Harris, which is that she would not answer straightforward questions about what she wanted. Yeah. In this conversation, you're basically asking Vice President Harris whether she thinks of herself as a liberal, someone who is interested in reforming institutions and society, or if she thinks about herself as a progressive, someone who wants to more holistically reimagine our society, to make it more equitable. And here's how she responded.
I think it depends on who you're talking to in terms of how they use the word. So I have. Why don't you define each one for me, and then I can tell you where I fit. If you want to say, for example, that believing that working people should receive a fair wage and be treated with dignity and that there is dignity in all work, well, then I don't know, what label do you give that one? Mm-hmm. If you believe that that parents should have affordable childcare, I'm not sure what the label is for that.
What was that moment like for you in the room with her?
Profiles are kind of hard because you learn so much about somebody. Mm-hmm. By the time I'm arriving to have this interview with her, I've talked to her childhood friends, I've talked to Democrats, I've talked to Republicans, I've talked to staff, family, you've talked to so many people. And you come up with a kind of theory on who someone is and how they've gotten to this point, and you structure these questions about that, whatever. But one thing that Kamala Harris does not like is being told by someone else who she is, And so there was something about those questions that I think immediately were off-putting in a way that I could have seen coming, but I kind of didn't. And so I had these questions thinking I was presenting to her this thing that had happened around her and was giving her agency to kind of reclaim back what she wants to say about it. But that ends up being the story in the end. She didn't want to say anything about it. She didn't want to engage. She didn't want to tell her own story. And honestly, I think that ends up being something you feel in the last 3 months, too. I think one of the ways that questions were so off-putting was that there was a sense that those were questions coming from me, individual hater, and not questions everybody had about her. Right. Everybody. No one knows that. No one has a good sense of where you're working from. People have big questions about why you changed from then to now. Those are questions that people have about you. And so that's the thing that I think ends up speaking to what happens in the future, is they never thought they had to tell. They never thought people were owed answers to that, And I think it settled with people. The flip-flopper settled with people, all because of those type of reasons. She never took control of the story.
Okay, given everything we just heard then, I guess my question to you is, was this election about Trump being a really strong candidate? Was it about Kamala Harris being a really flawed candidate? Or was it about something else entirely?
Yeah, I think that the people who tell you that Donald Trump was always going to win this, I don't believe. I don't think he is. I don't think he is some massively, I never thought he was some electoral lion that couldn't be beaten. And in fact, I think he tried to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory several times. Mm-hmm. I think the conditions were there for the Republicans to succeed because change was the desire. And for me, if there is a lesson, more than Donald Harris was bad and Trump was good, I would say Republicans reflected change and Democrats reflected the status quo. It's to me like the easiest way to understand the result. And that basically the public opponent's the top of the ticket of that because Joe Biden and the White House were the biggest examples. I've heard people say this is a sign that women can't win, that people of color can't win. There has to be a white guy. I don't know if I think that's true. Like, this was a sign Trump was always going to win. America wants all of these kind of sweeping changes he's going to bring about. I don't even know if that's true. I think a lot of people who voted for him probably aren't thrilled about RFK at our HHS or whatever. Mm-hmm. But what I do think is that it reminds me of the importance of a political process that includes the public. It reminds me of the public servant aspect of their job that they sometimes forget about. Because more than anything for Democrats, I think this was a process problem. I think this was a courage problem. I think this was a saying what is in your face that everyone kind of knows, but no one is saying problem. There wasn't a lack of evidence of Joe Biden's unpopularity, about how Americans thought he was unfit for a second term, about the implications of one term from 4 years ago. Like, all of that was there. The only thing that didn't happen was the willingness or honesty to act on it. It would be so sad to me if people come out of here with the lesson that Black women can't be president. Because honestly, I think if they would have moved like they were trying to make a Black woman president for the last 3-4 years, she might have. I guess I'm like, I think that you can't make a Black person president at the last minute after you basically told the country to not believe their eyes for 3 years. Like, that's what, And so I'm like, was this an evidence problem or was this an honesty problem? And so I actually don't think that's about Kamala Harris at all, except to the extent that she was reflective of that. Like, she could have been another person who did different things. But I think it's more of a story about political parties, political actors, and how they will prioritize tradition, deference, and their own self-preservation over the ideals they say that they're working for, even when they say democracy's on the line.
Astead Herndon covers politics for the New York Times, and he's the host of the politics podcast, The Run Up. Astead, I appreciate you for coming on, bro.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that is our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. If that's more your thing, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. And subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter, which is very, very dope, by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter.
And just a reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and public media. And you'll get to listen to every episode sponsor-free.
Let's go.
So please go find more at plus.npr.org/Code Switch.
This episode you're listening to was produced by Xavier Lopez and Christina Kala. It was edited by Leah Donnella, and our engineer was Kwesi Lee.
And a big shout out to the rest of the Code Switch massive: Jess Kung, Courtney Stein, Dahlia Mortada, Jasmine Romero, and Verilyn Williams.
I'm Gene Demby.
I'm B.A. Parker.
Be easy, y'all.
Hydrate.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify, the global commerce platform that helps you sell and show up exactly the way you want to. Customize your online store to your style. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/NPR. This message comes from Warby Parker. What makes a great pair of glasses? At Warby Parker, it's all the invisible extras without the extra cost, like free adjustments for life. Find your pair at warbyparker.com or visit one of their hundreds of stores around the country.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Charles Schwab. Independent registered investment advisors are fiduciaries. They must act in your best interest always. That's why Schwab is proud to support them. Visit findyourindependengadvisor.com.